Goedenavond en welkom bij deze eerste livestream van Logos Instituut van 2023. Dit is de eerste van dit jaar. Er zijn er vorig jaar al 13 eerder geweest. En die zijn allemaal terug te vinden op YouTube. Abonneer je of schrijf je in voor de nieuwsbrief. En dan ben je op de hoogte van alle ontwikkelingen, ook omtrent de livestreams van Logos. Logos Instituut helpt mensen zoeken naar heldere antwoorden als het gaat om het raakvlak geloof en wetenschap. En er zijn heel veel wetenschappelijke disciplines waar Logos artikelen over gepubliceerd heeft. Geologie, biologie, astronomie, maar ook ethiek, onderwijs, apologetiek. En u kunt ook sprekers aanvragen via de website van Logos, of in ieder geval via Logos, voor bijvoorbeeld school of kerk. Mijn naam is Nathan van Ree. Ik mag vanavond de livestream leiden en we hebben vanavond een hele bijzondere gast, namelijk Todd Wood uit Amerika. Hij is live bij ons. Aangezien Todd Engels spreekt, zal ik nu overgaan op mijn iets wat houterig klinkende Engels, zodat hij ook meekrijgt wat ik zeg. Yes, Todd, very warm welcome to you, and thank you for being us tonight with us. Being with us tonight.
Yeah.
Could you have a short introduction of yourself?
Sure. Let's see. I grew up a Christian in a Christian home and attended Christian schools most of my life. Earned a PhD in biochemistry and computational biology at the University of Virginia. I did a postdoc on working on the rice genome at Clemson University. And then I moved to Bryan College, where I was part of the Center for Origins Research for 13 years. And then 10 years ago, I launched with my friend Roger Sanders, Core Academy of Science. We're a ministry that's dedicated to raising up a new generation of faithful Christ-like researchers dedicated to exploring the hardest problems in creation. So we are an educational organization that works sort of outside the system alongside of other more formal schools. And I've been doing that for 10 years now, and the Lord's really blessed, and we've seen a lot of great fruit come from our labor. So we're happy to keep going.
That's great. Thank you. Tonight you'll be talking about what fossils say about Adam and Eve.
Yes.
During the presentation, you people at home can send us your questions and in the comments on YouTube and Facebook, and we'll make sure that they will be able to get passed on to Todd. So please do if you feel so, and if you feel some other people should watch the video, maybe afterwards, please share it and like it to support more views. Todd, I think that's enough for me now. So I'll hand it over to you. May God bless you.
All right, thank you. Let's get my down here. All right. Well, thank you very much for having me. It is always a pleasure to talk about my research interests. This has been the work that I've done now. Oh, goodness, past 13 years, I suppose, coming on 13 years now. I have always sort of had kind of a quiet interest in human origins. And so about 13 years ago, I began applying my background in computational biology to questions of how do we sort out these sorts of human fossils, make sense of them. So that's some of what I'm going to be sharing with you this evening. So let me start off just by talking a little bit here about the history of this debate. Right. So if we go back to this is a review of Origin. It is 10 years after Origin's been published. This is 1869. And this individual is commenting that it is strange here that if transmutation be a fact, if evolution is true, it is odd that during the whole historic period, not the slightest approximation to the missing link has ever been noted. And in 1869, that's not really far off. They did not know about the really startling and surprising fossils that would be discovered in the 20th century. And so now we have dozens, even hundreds of different fossils that have been forward as evidence of human evolution. And for some, this is literally definitive, right? This is the hard proof, the hard evidence that everyone's looking for that human evolution happened. And so obviously I'm going to be pretty interested in examining this, right? And you can see here, you arrange these by virtue of their shared characteristics, and you can create this what is essentially an evolutionary tree. And over on the right, I've sort of ordered the tree here so that it sort of goes from the right to the left. On the left, you have the sort of more recent fossils, and on the right, you have the more ancient fossils. This is all by conventional dating. The scale there is radiometric, millions of radiometric years before present. And the bars there represent the roughly the range in which these different fossil forms have been discovered. And people ask me, how do you know that this is really, that fossil or whatever? And that's a legitimate question. I'm not going to worry too much about that right here. My interest is going to be sort of, let's just take the fossils as they are and see what we can do with them. Now, the common responses to this from sort of Bible-believing Christians, you have a number of, there's just a whole range. One option is to simply, if this is correct, evolution is a fact. There was never any Adam and Eve, and the Bible is just a book written by Bronze Age shepherds, and no one should listen to it. That's a bit of the cynical Dawkins style scoffing atheist perspective. Then others will say, well, maybe the Bible is metaphorical and science gives us the details. The Bible tells us the who of creation, who did it, but it doesn't really tell us how. Science is there to sort of fill in all those sorts of questions that the Bible cannot answer for us. And so they're interested in sort of smoothing over perceived differences between the Bible and science. Then on the other side of the spectrum, you get folks who will tell me quite firmly that this is all just made up. All this stuff is fraudulent and fake. I have had the privilege now of examining some of these fossils in person. I'm convinced they're real. I didn't see anything there that would give me any indication that what I was looking at was not a real fossil. So I don't buy that response. Others tell me that it's easy to tell that some fossils are human, others are just apes. I'm not so sure that's true. Maybe it is for some things. I'm not so sure it's true for everything. And then, of course, you always have the people who just, they're firm with me and the missing link is still missing. It's 150 years. There is no missing link. And I think, all right, well, if you're talking about the sort of clinching evidence of human evolution, maybe that might be true. Maybe. But if you're talking about things that share characteristics that are found today in only humans or today in only apes, well, there's a lot of those. So maybe they're not the missing link. Maybe they're not, evolutionary intermediates. Maybe there's something else, but I don't think that we could just shrug them off and say they don't exist. So if we go back to the scripture and we think about, all right, well, what does the Bible actually tell us about these things? Something that we read here, this is good old King James Version. The Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground, breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. In Genesis 1, we read that God created man and woman in his own image. So if I'm sort of trying to think about the fossil record theologically, I need to test for this, right? That these fossils had that human, whatever it was, the human image, the image of God, the human soul. It's all right. Well, yeah, that's that's a hard problem, really, honestly. It's not always obvious how one would do that. So some thorny questions. Let's just address these right away. What do I mean by human? For me, I would understand human sense to be descended from Adam and Eve. In another sense, I would understand them to be sort of a theological category of creatures, God's creatures made in his image. So this is a little different than, say, Homo sapiens, right? The sort of scientific definition of what is human. They're going to be looking at characteristics of the skull. They're going to be looking at genomic stuff. They're going to be looking at biology. That makes up a human being. And so when you hear evolutionists talk about the origin of humans, human could be all manner of different things to them. I've heard it applied to things that are, I think, clearly ape. I've heard it applied to things that are not Homo sapiens. I've heard some people use it only as Homo sapiens. I'm going to use it as descended from Adam and Eve, and I'm going to use it as something made in the image of God. Another thorny problem, of course, is, well, what do I mean by the image of God? And there have been multiple ideas put forward for what exactly the image of God is. And as I was thinking through this and preparing for this presentation, I sort of looked up some ideas about how the image of God relates to particularly the fossil record. And you can see here just a couple of papers that I just randomly pulled out by various authors, including Vandenbrink. He's represented here in one of these papers. And I was trying to look at the variety of answers that people have had to this idea of, what is the image of God? How does it relate to these forms of fossils? And my position, I would describe more as a synthetic position. I know that there are these theological categories. I take something in the middle. At least that's how I perceive it. So certainly, Christians have understood the image of God to refer to somehow human uniqueness, that the image of God is what sets us apart from animals, and it is a set of qualities, particularly mental capacities, our ability to use tools, our ability to reason, our ability to transform our environment, our ability to relate to one another, our ability to relate to God. And all of these things are sort of wrapped up in this quality-based understanding of the image of God. So this is what the image of God is. It's about the qualities that make us human, that set us apart. More recently, there have been those who have argued that the image of God really is more of a position that we hold. Or perhaps it should be understood as a theological category, a capacity to have a relationship with God. It's the possibility of having a relationship with God. And these are based, I think, on some really interesting readings of the text of the Hebrew Bible. And so I don't want to just shrug this off as being some sort of weird new thing, because I think there's some really important insight here, particularly the word image, selem, that's used in the Old Testament for the image of God, is also a word that's used in other contexts for idols. And so that gives us sort of a really interesting way to think about what it is to be the image. Because the image, if the image is analogous to what an idol does, if the function of the image is analogous to what the function of an idol is, you can see that an idol, an idol worshiper knows the idol is not the actual God. It's a representation of their God. It's a physical manifestation of their God. And if that's what we are, well, that's a pretty exciting thing. We have the position of manifesting God here in creation. So I think there's some really interesting insights there that come from a more careful textual analysis. I tend to think that they're both on the right track. That if we're going to occupy this position as the image of God, then we need certain mental and spiritual qualities, right? If we're going to, in the wholeness of who we are, reflect what God is as creator and master of this universe, then we need the ability to do that, right? And so I tend to think that the modern positional view of the image of God is sort of converging with the old quality-based image of God onto a sort of a new, not really new, but a better understanding of what the image is, which then, and this is the important part, I think that lends itself to helping us sort of think about what we see in the fossil record. Because I think as we look into the fossil record, we find that there are other, let's call them other humans, that manifest these capabilities, which suggests that there are other sorts of people that have lived on the earth in the past that are also human. So I recently wrote a review trying to summarize my thoughts on this subject. I co-wrote it with some colleagues, and we sort of went through, tried to sort of hammer out what sort of things would signal the kind of mental capacity one would need for mastering his environment and becoming sort of the image of God, or manifesting the image of God. And we came up with 6 things that you encounter somewhat frequently in the fossil record. One would be the controlled use of fire. This is something that is unknown among the animals and actually requires pretty sophisticated abilities and thought processes to be able to sit down and not only make a fire, start a fire, but to control it and to use it for light and heat and cooking. Sophisticated tools would be another example of the sorts of things that I would expect. And this one's a bit mushy because, of course, you can get down to the fact that, well, monkeys bang rocks together to crack open nuts. So does that make them the image of God? Right. So we have to be careful about how we're going to evaluate these things and what counts as a sophisticated tool. But I definitely think some of the kinds of tools that you see in the stone tool record definitely indicate planning and intentional modification. The person making that has an idea in mind, a pattern in mind that he is trying to produce. Definitely evidence of art decoration. This is more difficult to come across in the fossil record, although it is definitely becoming more common. We'll talk a little bit about some of those evidences. Occasionally you come across individuals who have healed wounds that might indicate somebody was taking care of them, because the wound is so grievous. It's hard to imagine them surviving it. So that might indicate the sort of care for others that you would also expect to see in a human being. Intentional burial, another example here, not just tossing a body aside, but treating it with some sort of respect, and intentionally burying it in the ground would be another evidence, I think, of a human understanding of death and a human understanding of individuals. And then I sort of have this catch-all thing, complex dispersal or exploration. This would include things like finding trace evidences of these people deep in the dark zone of caves, perhaps finding them on remote islands where you'd have to cross miles of open water to arrive at this place. So these would be the sorts of things that you would think, these are definitely not things that just animals are doing. These are things that people are engaging in. And so when you find those evidences, you think people must have been here. So let's just begin our tour here with the Neanderthals. Fire use in Neanderthals is well attested. We know of places where Neanderthals had hearths. We know they were cooking their food. We know they were probably using fire for warmth. So that's an easy evidence to establish with Neanderthals. The tools, we have evidence here not only of sophisticated Mousterian technology, the sort of stone tools that they were making, but recently we've discovered evidence of tar that was used as a glue to create composite tools, where you would mount a stone tip on the end of a wooden shaft and use that for a tool that's better than just a pointy stick as a spear. Neanderthals, I think, pretty clearly exhibit a concern for artistic things. We have widespread evidence of the use of red ochre by Neanderthals. We have in Southern Europe a number of sites. We have Neanderthals using shells. And then we have evidence of not just using shells, but shells that have been bored. A hole has been bored through them. And then we find ochre smeared on the shell. So not only are they creating probably little pendants to wear, but they have colored those pendants with ochre. In several cave sites, we found eagle talons that have been cut such that they appear to have been strung on some sort of pendant again. So they're using them as decoration. And now coming to light, we have evidence of carvings as well. So Neanderthals have pretty sophisticated mental capacities beyond just the use of materials in order to get tools, to get food or resources. They are deliberately thinking about things in artistic ways. They are taking pleasure in color. They are taking pleasure in forms that they find in their environment or forms that they make. Care for the elderly. Shanidar 1 is the classic example of this. Shanidar is a cave in northern Iraq in Kurdish territory. And Shanidar 1 is an individual that was found there, a Neanderthal individual that was found there, a skeleton that has a partially, an amputated arm and wounds to his head that probably left him deaf in one ear and blind in one eye. So this poor soul suffered some pretty serious wounds when he was alive and lived to tell about it. So the amputation, whether it was intentional or obtained during conflict, we don't know, but the bone has clearly grown back. So he survived losing a limb. That's really, in my estimation, I know animals are pretty resilient, but for a person to lose a limb and survive it, I think that requires some pretty careful care of that individual. So I think that counts as care for the wounded, definitely. Intentional burial, there's lots of evidence of intentional burial in Neanderthals, although this is somewhat controversial by people who are a little more careful and demanding of their evidence. But I think the evidence at La Chapelle, for example, in France, is pretty convincing. Recent excavations have shown the clear distinction between the original dirt in the cave and the place where this individual was found. Apparently backfill that was part of the excavation of the grave of this individual. Shanidar Z is another skeleton that was recently found in Shanidar Cave. And there it's laid out nicely, and there's a rock under his head. So again, I think that's pretty good evidence. These individuals there was a grave dug, the person was put into it and carefully covered over with dirt. And then dispersal, we have all sorts of really interesting evidences of Neanderthal dispersal. We have in the Aegean, we have a number of islands where Neanderthal stone tools have been found. Again, some of those are controversial, but I think it's pretty good evidence that these guys knew how to cross open water. And then if that's not good enough, recently in Brudical Cave, we have evidence of this really strange thing where they have broken down stalactites and stalagmites and arranged them in sort of a circle. There's some burning evidence in places, but it's not an occupation site. It doesn't appear to be a place where the Neanderthals lived, and it's several hours into the dark zone of the cave. So what exactly that is, we don't know. But they are definitely occupying caves, exploring caves, and probably exploring islands as well. So Neanderthals, to me, it's kind of a slam dunk. These are definitely exhibiting all the sorts of attributes I would associate with human beings in the image of God. Erectus, it's a little less clear. Fire use, there's a lot of places where Homo erectus is said to have been associated with possible evidence of fire. But of course, wildfires are common, so it's a little bit more difficult to say this is clearly a controlled fire. There's a site in Israel, northern Israel, Gesher Bennett Yaakov, where hearths have been found that are the right radiometric age for Homo erectus. However, physical remains of Homo erectus have not been found at the site. So that's kind of an indirect thing that sort of implies that Homo erectus were making fire, but it's not directly associated with their remains. Some people think that's good enough. I want to be careful about that. Tools, the Acheulean hand axe, I think, is especially important in this regard. I have one right here. So this is a typical Acheulean hand axe. It is, you can see, it is flaked on both sides, intentionally shaped and flaked on both sides, and it's intentionally shaped into this particular form, right? So it's got this nice sort of a teardrop shape to it, and it's chipped on both sides again, and it creates this sharp edge. Obviously, this one's a surface discovery, and it's no longer sharp. But when that was first napped, it was pretty sharp, I'm sure. Then one end is sort of blunt, and it would be the end that you would hold as you use the tool. Now, the key thing here is that clearly they have in mind, I'm going for this shape. This is not just an accidental discovery that if I whack a rock that it makes a sharp edge. These are clearly being shaped to create this particular form that's quite good for using as a hand axe. So I would say that's a little more than just what I would expect an animal to be able to do. In terms of art, it's pretty slim, but there is a site in Indonesia where there appears to be a seashell that was carved intentionally. It's got some really peculiar looking scratch marks on it. Forms kind of the letter W, or the letter Z, I suppose it was on the side. And is that art? I don't know. Is it functional? Probably not. Are they doodling? Could be. Hard to say. But that's really the best we have of art evidence from Homo erectus, as far as I'm aware. Care for the elderly or the wounded. No, we don't know about that. Intentional burial, again, we're not sure about that either. Dispersal, well, there is an island off of Africa, quite a ways off of Africa, called Socotra. It is presently part of the country of Yemen. It's off the Horn of Africa, several dozen miles off of the coast of Africa, and I believe more than 100 miles off the coast of Yemen. So this is not an island that you would see, but Acheulean stone tools have been found on Socotra. A Russian expedition discovered this cache of Acheulean hand axes there. And it's published in Russian, so I don't read Russian. So, but you can see the pictures, and you can sort of use Google Translate to figure out, yep, they're claiming these were found on Socotra. So if that's true, that's pretty amazing that Homo erectus were able to get out there. If, of course, these are in fact tools made by Homo erectus. But they're the ones making Acheulean hand axes mostly. So it seems pretty good. And if they're not the ones that left those, whoever did leave them had to get out all the way to Socotra. So it's I think pretty good evidence of pretty good dispersal. So Homo erectus maybe is not as good at leaving these kinds of evidences as Neanderthals, but I still think there's something, there's a number of these things that are sufficiently interesting to me to suggest that these guys are not just your ordinary animal. Another example here is where we have these sorts of material culture remains is Homo floresiensis. This one is, I'll just say it right away, is limited. Floresiensis is the so-called hobbit from Indonesia. It is a skeleton, quite small. There are associated other remains from other skeletons as well. Not a lot of evidence associated with it, but we definitely have stone tools. The cave where the remains of Homo floresiensis found is reported as having a hearth from a fire, so we have that as well. We don't clearly have any evidence of art from these individuals or care for the elderly or wounded or intentional burial. Dispersal, however, this one's more interesting because Flores is past what is called the Wallace Line, which separates Southeast Asia from Australasia. And the separation is due to really, really, really strong currents that run between some of the Indonesian islands. And so even though you can see from one island to the next, and you can see Flores from the adjacent island, you still have to cross some of the most treacherous ocean in the world. So it's not likely that if these are just animals, it's not likely that they just wandered across there. Generally, the Wallace Line is understood to be a separation of dispersal, where the sort of marsupial fauna that you find in Australasia, they go up so far into that archipelago, but not any into the Indonesian archipelago, but not any farther. And then animals from Southeast Asia move down, but they stop at the Wallace Line. And so, yeah, so these guys are on the other side of the Wallace Line from Southeast Asia. So they must have intentionally crossed. I mean, that's the easiest way to explain that. So you have three evidences there. You have fire, you have tools, and you have complex evidence of dispersal. Now, if we sort of put this into a big chart, start thinking about some of these other things. Now, here's the drawback of this approach, right? When I find evidences and I say, yes, this exhibits this sort of evidence, if you get enough of those things in one of these species, you would say, yeah, that's pretty clear evidence that these guys are probably human. But on the other hand, you've got a bunch of these other things over here, things like Homo habilis, Homo rudolfensis, Australopithecus sediba, other Australopithecus, Lucy skeleton, and all those guys. And they're not clearly associated with most of these evidences. I say that carefully because I know the stone tool record is quite old and quite abundant. The difficulty with that record is that it's very difficult to associate it unambiguously with one form in the fossil record. I'm thinking especially here of East Africa, where we have multiple species of a ape called Paranthropus living. We have multiple species of Australopithecus there, and we have multiple species of Homo. So who made those stone tools? Well, excuse me. That's a good question. Yeah, so I just put question marks here. Now, some people would say this thing has no evidence of being human. And they would try to argue that Australopithecus is not human because it has no material cultural evidence associated with it. I tend to fall back on the old scientific adage that absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence. That just because you don't find a thing doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. So the absence of material cultural evidences from these other forms of hominin, that might be evidence that they didn't have any material culture, or it might be evidence that we just haven't found it yet. So basically, these criteria that I've introduced here, they work only one direction, in my opinion. When you find clear evidences that you can associate with, say, Neanderthals, you can say Neanderthals are probably human. But when you find a lack of evidence, the best you can say is, well, we don't know. So I need some other way of evaluating these things, because I don't want to just evaluate whether the image of God appears in other things. I want to evaluate, is there a line to be drawn between the image of God and other creatures? Is there a way to say, simply from the way God made us in our bodies and our skeletons, that there are humans in one category and non-humans in another? Or did God make some weird situation where it all just sort of blends together and it's hard to tell? So what about the rest? How do I deal if I've got Neanderthals, I've got Erectus as a possibility. Neanderthals definitely human, Erectus possibly human, Homo floresiensis possibly human. What about everything else? All right, so to do this, I've initially been working with the sorts of characteristics that an anthropologist would use to generate this kind of evolutionary tree right here. And my interest there was not simply to arrange things in a tree. The thing about these sorts of analyses is that when I do an evolutionary analysis like this, I'm basically telling the computer to give me the best evolutionary tree that it can find. What I don't ask is whether an evolutionary tree is the best thing to explore or display or represent the similarities of creatures. So if there was a big gap somewhere on this tree, you wouldn't be able to find it necessarily with tree building methods. So as I've said, the past 13 years now, I've been working on various methods of cluster analysis. So this shows you an example of one of these that I generated for a recent paper, where I took the characteristics that were used in the most recent evolutionary phylogeny of hominins, and I simply asked, well, how many of these are shared in common by different species? And then I created this diagram here. This is just a two-dimensional representation, so it's a little distorted. It's actually quite a bit distorted, but yeah, it's sort of a map. If you could imagine, say, if I gave you the driving times between various Dutch cities, you had enough cities and you had driving times, you could actually, there's computer programs that will generate a map of those cities. And it's actually not that far off. Pretty cool. Same kind of deal I'm using here. I'm using these sort of distances that are calculated as differences between the things, the characteristics that they possess. And then I sort of say, all right, well, give me a map. And in this case, it's a two-dimensional map. It's not a great map, but it's a map. And I've got other methods as well that I can do this cluster analysis in. But this is a really good way to sort of show you what it looks like. The blue guys over there are Paranthropus. Paranthropus are these weird upright apes. They have, oh goodness, they have extremely heavy, monstrously large skulls. They have a big crest running down the middle of the top of their skull, like a gorilla does. They have extremely large jaws. They look like their heads look like little tanks. They're just built really solidly. And you can see they're nowhere near anything else in this diagram. So there's enough uniqueness in these creatures to really set them apart. Now, the red and the green dots, the red represents Homo, which is our group of species, and then the green represents Australopithecus. And in this case, I forget what the square is symbolizing. That'll show up in a future slide. But the key here is that there does seem to be some separation. It's not quite as clean as the Paranthropus separated from everything else. But statistically, if you do actual cluster analysis, you will find that those things separate neatly. So here's a summary of the cluster analysis that I've been doing. The blue represents things that I think are not human. The green on the bottom represents things that I think are human. Every column is a different way of calculating the clusters. And you can see based on those characteristics I was just showing you, there is agreement across, 16 different methods of clustering. It's really pretty impressive. This is the kind of stuff that statisticians really like. No matter how you calculate the clusters, you always get the same answer, which tells you that the clusters are probably real and not just some artifact of trying to force things to be in clusters, which is pretty neat. So the key thing here to note is that it separates out. It separates out humans in green from things that are not human in blue. And it does it really well. Now, a more recent, a more complete set of characteristics. This includes more things than just the few groups that I just showed you. So there's more fossils in this. There are more characteristics in this as well. This is almost 400 different skull characteristics. The red again represents Homo, which is our group, and the green represents Australopithecus. And now this is a bit messier. You've got this one in the diamond there, sort of at the top in the middle. That's Homo floresiensis. This one's a real puzzler to me. The more I try to figure out what Homo floresiensis is like in its skeleton, the more it sort of wanders away from the Homo cluster. And that is something I did not expect to see. I expected it to be a pretty clear human being based on the material culture evidence, and it's sort of anatomically quite surprisingly different. Now, this seems to show you that it's sort of grouping with Australopithecus. You might think that. Actually, if you look at it in multiple dimensions, you can see it doesn't group with them either. It sort of groups all, it sort of makes its own little cluster by itself. So the square is something called Australopithecus sediba, which I tend to think might not be Australopithecus, might be Homo. And the circle there is representing Homo naledi. You might remember Homo naledi. It was in the news a number of years ago from the Rising Star Cave discovery in South Africa. Thousands of bones have been recovered now from this cave that apparently was potentially a burial site for these individuals. So, and as a burial site, I sort of expected this is probably going to end up in the cluster with humans, and sure enough, the skull characteristics do put it there as well. Same sort of diagram. This time it's a little messier. We don't have quite the clean, obvious division between human and non-human that we had before. But the key thing to note here, this row right here that is half blue and half green, that's Homo floresiensis. So this is a case where I think, okay, the problem is Homo floresiensis is anatomically quite different from the rest of us people. And so it's sort of making its own cluster that is not part of the human cluster and not part of the non-human cluster either. And so when you try to force it to be one or the other, it's just picking sides randomly. And that's why you get that to be that way. But otherwise, the material culture, I think, is pretty clear. Then you have Australopithecus africanus here, which 2 times in this analysis, 2 times out of 16, groups with the humans. It does so in a set of characteristics and statistics that let me suspect that this is not a high quality clustering of those individuals. Basically, there are various diagnostic statistics you can get from clustering that tell you whether you got a good cluster or not, and that's not a good cluster. So that makes sense that if you put them in the wrong group, it does make a poor cluster. But otherwise, most of these things fall out into categories that make sense. Humans, Neanderthals, Homo erectus, they all end up in the human category. Australopithecus afarensis, the Lucy fossil, Australopithecus africanus, which is from South Africa, chimpanzees and gorillas, they're all clearly not human. So this is all very reassuring and very interesting and very exciting. And it sort of gives me a better way to not just say, I think these guys are human, but it also gives me a way to think through, I think these are not human. If you'd like more information, if you didn't follow any of what I just said and you want to actually dig into this, I have this paper. You can find it, just Google title, it will take you right to it. That explains most of what I've shown you. Will give you some of the details, and it will give you references to all the methodology that I used and how I calculated all those sorts of things. So that leaves me with sort of a humankind, if you will, right? And on the top, I've listed the things that I feel are pretty solidly human. The material culture evidence coincides with what I'm getting from the clustering evidence. So Homo sapiens, which obviously has plenty of material culture associated with us, Neanderthals, and Homo erectus. And the clustering and the material culture both line up to say these guys are human. Floresiensis, I put in the sort of I'm not so sure category, not because I doubt the evidence of material culture, but because the clustering really doesn't line up. And so I'm still working on that one, trying to understand better, because it sure looks human to me, but when I start looking at the individual characteristics, it's just different. So there's something funny about Homo floresiensis. Not sure what it is yet. And then the others, Habilis, rudolfensis, and Sediba there, you know, if those turn out to be not human, I'm not going to lose any sleep over it. The clustering seems to say that they are. And, you know, if they're not, that's fine. Am I sure? Sure. Yes. No. Ask me next week. I'll give you a different answer. Now, what about the skeleton? Good question. And that's been the object of my research for the past 7 years. Everything that I've shown you so far from the clustering has been all about just the skull and the teeth and the jaws. I haven't shown you anything related to everything down from the neck down, which is, you know, a lot of the body, right? And it would be nice if we could say something about the rest of the skeleton. And now, with so many new forms of hominin and so many new discoveries of skeletal material, we have a lot of resources to be able to say things about that. So I ran that for 3 years. I'm going to present that work, some of that work here at hopefully the International Conference on Creationism. If they approve my manuscript, we'll see how that goes. But that's my intention, to present this at the ICC, which happens this summer in July. And hopefully we'll have some answers pretty soon about, what does the skeleton tell us about these things? And of course, then the big question, how old is Adam anyway? Now, for me, that is not the same sort of question as saying, are these human? Are these not human? It's a more complicated question. It involves issues of geology. It involves issues of radiometric dating, and not just carbon dating, but other forms of radiometric dating. And so this is a big can of worms. It's a can of worms that I'm very interested in opening. But I don't really have the skill set as a geologist that I would need, right, to be able to do that. I'm not a geologist. I'm a computational biologist. And so I can sort of bug my geology friends, but I don't have a good answer to understanding the geology, the geological evidence in a young age creationist format and framework. But I can tell you, if I had a model of how this all would work together, it would be this. It would be something like this, where we have Adam as progenitor of everyone. And then we have these branches of human beings coming off from Adam. And again, some of these might be wrong. Some of these might be apes that snuck onto the tree and probably need to be banished back to apehood. And it might be that there are other humans that we haven't discovered yet that should be included on the tree as well. But this is basically my understanding of how this works. These are separate creations. These are the image of God. And they represent this much wider diversity of form than we have in the modern world. Other lingering questions, again, I don't want to pretend like I've answered everything here. There's issues of the human genome. I haven't even touched on that. And that's a big area of research, especially among lots of creationists working on the human genome issues. Archaeological evidences. This is becoming a pretty big interest of mine, trying to figure out, well, how does the Bronze Age and the pre-pottery world, the Stone Age, how does that all work together in our understanding of human history on the planet? Is that evidence of a longer history? Is my young age creationist belief wrong, or are there ways to sort of understand this in a young Earth context? And of course, the next big fossil discovery, right? Sometimes I get criticized, and I think this is a really weird criticism, but I've heard people say this, that you shouldn't believe what I say, or you shouldn't listen to me, because what happens if somehow my clustering turns out to put humans and chimpanzees in the same cluster? Clearly that's wrong. So that can't happen. And so my research is bogus. One of my responses would be, that hasn't happened. I've done this. I've lost track of how many times I've done this with multiple combinations of characteristics and multiple combinations of hominin taxa. I have never seen any credible evidence that would suggest that humans belong in the same created kind as apes. There's always a pretty clear distinction. And so that sort of gives me confidence to think, well, throw at me what you got. I'm betting it's not going to collapse these clusters. I think it's going to show up in the human cluster or the ape cluster, but not in both, or not bridge the two. So I'm looking forward, honestly, to the next discovery. I know that there are some new material that has been found in South Africa, because these folks have been sharing their discoveries on social media. So I know they're coming. And I know we've been teased the number of discoveries regarding Honoledi, the peculiar creature that probably was burying their dead tribe mate in a cave in South Africa. So I'm looking forward to seeing what the new evidence is and how it might fit together into our creationist understanding of human origins. I think it's exciting myself. Now, if you'd like more information about me and my work, I invite you to check us out coursei.org/connect, place to go. That will give you links to important information about Core Academy that we would love for you to learn about. It also has links to all of our social media. There you'll also find out information about the Let's Talk Creation podcast. Some of you probably already familiar with that. That comes out every 2 weeks, pretty much all the time. And we try to provide a unique and thoughtful approach to creation discussions about various issues in the world of creation research. So check us out, and thank you so much for your attention. And I guess we'll move on to the question and answer period.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Wood. We have at least one question from Martin de Boek, and I'll quote, Dr. Wood, can you explain to us in what kind of geological layers most humanoid fossils have been found? How do we, as creationists believing in the young earth, attribute an age to these fossils? I know you touched on it a bit, but maybe you can elaborate.
Sure. So I'll give you an example. I recently did a little research project. It took me a long time. I created a catalog of Neanderthal sites that had been found, and I wanted to know the geological context of things. Basically, exactly what this person. What I found that was really interesting about it: nearly 80% of Neanderthal remains, either stone tools or physical bones of the Neanderthals, they're found in caves, in actual caves. So these are, they're very localized, very superficial sorts of deposits that these sorts of things are found in. They're found in the very, if you think in terms of the whole fossil record, the Mesozoic and the Cenozoic and so forth, these sorts of fossils, the hominins, would be found at the very, very top of the fossil record. So that's one of the reasons why the evolutionists will tell you that humans, humans evolved recently, because we come in the most recent stuff. In my mind, what I think that tells us is that all of the hominin fossils are deposited after the flood, and some of them aren't even fossils. The leady material apparently is not even fully mineralized. So, and that's definitely true for a lot of the Neanderthal material as well. So these are superficial, very regional deposits. They're the highest layers of the fossil record, and so that would suggest that we're looking at things that have been buried since the flood.
Okay, thank you. Questions are coming in. We have here one from Rupert Poop. Your data set contains 400 different skull characteristics. Do you have 400 characteristics for each taxon, or 350 for one taxon, 200 for another, etc.?
Yeah. So the answer is I do not have all characteristics for all of the taxa. I wish that were the case. The completeness of the character set depends on the actual taxon that we're talking about. Some of them are fairly complete because there's lots of skull material. So Neanderthals are pretty good because we have lots of Neanderthal skulls. In other cases, we have only 1 or 2 skulls. And so those tend to be quite incomplete. And there's a few taxa in there that are not associated with complete skulls, in which case we don't have very much information at all. So that's another area that I'm very interested in working on, because you could imagine, if I'm sampling these characteristics, am I sampling the right sort of characteristics, right? If I sample a lot of them, I imagine that somewhere in that mix of a lot of characteristics, I've hit on some important characteristics that are useful for clustering. But if I have something that only has 100 versus something comparing it to something that only has 400, or worse. I mean, there's some that only have 50 or 30 characteristics known. Is that really legitimate to put those in the same kind of a clustering analysis? So that's definitely an area that I'm very interested in working on, and it's an area that I have, in fact, been working on, specifically with the Hobbit, the Homo floresiensis. I'm trying to fill in more information about that from published sources and photographs.
Yes, it's indeed. You have to work with what you have.
You do, yeah.
Yeah. He also elaborated on his question, so maybe I can first go to that and then to the question that we just saw appear. Are these characters independent? For example, if you have a heavier mandibula, you might also have heavier teeth. If they're not independent, wouldn't that skew your results into getting clearer clusters?
Are they dependent? Good question. And so that's another area that I'm really getting more into lately. So the sort of simple answer is, since we're dealing with a skull and we're dealing with 400 characteristics, I think we're bound to be dealing with some things that overlap, right? As the question says, if you have a heavy mandible, a heavy jaw, you're going to have big teeth. Yep, you're probably right. So that's something that I want to sort of start to weed out, or try to weed out, or at least experiment on what happens when I weed them out, right? But I can tell you, looking at the characteristics, there's not a lot of characteristics that are obviously the same sort of thing. So if you think of that in terms of, say, you have, say, 20 different hominin taxa, and you look at the characteristics, the specific characteristics that they share in common, there isn't a lot of places where you can say, you know, these 20 characters are basically telling us exactly the same thing, exactly the same clustering. There's quite a lot of variability. So on the one hand, yes, I'm definitely interested in the question, are there correlations between the character states and the taxa, different character states with respect to the taxa. But when I look for them in the characters, I don't really see that superficially, you know, at the simplest level. So I'm really interested in pursuing that as another future project of sort of exploring more with these characteristics and the clustering.
Well, it's very, very encouraging that you're covering all these grounds already. And
yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no superficiality there. We have one question from H. Hi, Dr. Todd Wood. Is it not better to start the genealogy from Noah instead of Adam? Because all lives are destroyed by the flood. It is still not possible to find skeletons from people before the flood.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Right now, the only reason I talk about Adam right now is because that is the fashionable thing in American evangelical circles. Everybody is and has been for quite some time, about a decade now, quite interested in sort of figuring out whether we can accept evolution and get rid of Adam and be okay theologically, or can we accept a form of evolution that preserves Adam, right? The real historical Adam, or do we have to modify evolution in some way or interpret evolution in a particular way in order to keep Adam as the progenitor of human beings and so forth? So I'm mostly following the fashion, the current fad here in the United States when I focus on questions about Adam. But yes, technically, as a young age creationist, my own model would be these are all children of Noah. Because, as I said, these deposits that you find them in are all very superficial, very localized, not very big at all, not the kind of thing I would think would be associated with the flood. And so I think they're all after the flood. They're all colonizers from Noah's Ark. And so these are probably descendants somehow from Adam. Now, from Noah. Now, how that works exactly, I don't know. Could there be some, for example, some diversity preserved through the flood in the form of Noah's daughters-in-law, his sons' wives? Could they be from diverse forms of human beings? So maybe one of his sons married a Neanderthal. I don't know. So that the Neanderthals are something from before the flood that came through the flood by virtue of that. I don't know. Do we have to generate all this diversity just from Noah, where Noah is a population of just one thing? Noah and his family is just one homogenous thing. I don't know. And I'm not sure anybody really knows. So those are the sorts of things that I think about with respect to that. But yeah, definitely Noah, and for perspective of other people in the evangelical world here in the United States. Yeah, I talk a lot about the historical Adam and how our young age creation model fits with the kinds of questions that those folks are interested in.
Yeah, exactly what like you say. It's mostly the name that comes up,
Right.
Adam,
Right.
but maybe it's also we tend to think of humans representing the way we look and
Yes.
behave, maybe, and who's to tell that was not always the case. So
Right. Yeah.
Well, I don't see very much new questions
Okay.
appearing yet, but I have, of course, some. Oh, there's a new one.
Okay.
Well, it's Rupert the Poop again. So you're going in depth a bit. How do you weigh characters? I've heard you single out the position of the foramen magnum. That's the hole in the back.
That's right.
Well, sort of placing where the neck
Mm-hmm.
goes in. And then as an important diagnostic character, but in your data set, it would be just one out of the 400 traits. Is there a danger that important traits are swamped by many unimportant ones? So
Sure,
basically, what he's saying is,
How do I handle that?
how
And
to
yes,
differentiate.
so this would be one of those sort of technical questions that comes up all the time when I talk about my research with other scientists. They want to know about character weighting. How do you decide what's the really important character? And this, in some sense, comes from, on the one hand, scientific experience with recognizing what a species is, right? And so we recognize a species because it has these particular characteristics that are always different from this population over here. And so we say, well, this is always different, and it's somehow diagnostic of this population. So this population must be a species. And so we think of those sorts of characteristics as being really important. And then you have sort of the lay presentations that you often hear, or you might read about in social media or see on YouTube or something like that, where someone will tell you, well, it's this is what an ape is like, and this is what a human is like. So the foramen magnum, for example, this is one of those characteristics that I just bring up sometimes, and I say, well, in creatures that walk upright, they tend to have their foramen magnum pushed forward so that it's right underneath the skull. It's right. You sort of stick my hand in my neck here, that would be where it is, because my skull sits on top of my neck so that I can have my face looking where I'm going. That's always helpful. Whereas an ape, they're walking around on four legs like a chimpanzee. He in his skull, it sits like this on top of his backbone. The backbone comes in at an angle because his face is over here. He needs to face where he's going. And so because he's on all fours, the foramen magnum is pushed back farther towards the back of the skull. So is that an important characteristic for deciding whether something is human or not human? Some people tell me, yeah, these are the characteristics that define human and not human. And I think, how does one decide that is the case. And I'm not sure. When I look at Neanderthals and I see how startlingly different they are in just about every bone of their body, I wonder about too quickly judging and saying this is clearly human and this is clearly non-human, and these are the characteristics we can use to determine that. Now, as far as my own research and approach to deciding what's important and what's not important, for me, it's always about more is better. I don't tend to think in terms of the idea that there's going to be one or small handful of characteristics that are always going to define human beings. Maybe, spiritual capacity, the image of God, but is it possible to find a person that's living so primitively that you hardly even notice that? I suppose. Yes, I suppose that's true. You can find people like that. My own approach with character weighting, as I said, is to weight everything evenly in an individual analysis. However, I'm constantly looking at different samples of characteristics and different samples of taxa to see if I get the same result. And that, I think, is really important, because that is also a form of character weighting, right? I've decided I'm going to look at just this 100 characteristics versus this 200 over here. That's a kind of character weighting, right? I've decided that these 100 I'm not going to bother with right now. So subdividing characteristics or looking at alternative samples of characteristics, those I think are important ways of character weighting. And so far, everything's given me the same answer. So what are the most important characteristics for determining what is human or not human? I don't know. I have yet to decide that. And I just completed another research project where I've done similar kinds of things, sort of selecting out particular characteristics that I think might be really helpful for defining human versus non-human. And it wasn't terribly successful in terms of really delineating out humans versus non-human on an individual study basis. It's an ongoing, active area of research, and I don't have a really good answer for you yet. But stay tuned, because I'm working on it.
That's great. Yes. Well, of course, you always have also the risk of some kind of circular reasoning involved if you try to determine whether something is human or not, taking your picture of a human as, say, the blueprint for what you're looking for.
Right.
Right. So that could make you having things weighing more than they should weigh.
Yes. Yeah. You decide the characteristics that define human are what I'm like, right? That's the knee-jerk reaction, right? I'm human, so what I look like is what humans are. So this is where you get folks sort of in the non-creationist evangelical world. They're looking around and going, Homo sapiens is human. Adam and Eve must have been Homo sapiens, which I don't know how they do that with Neanderthals being so very human. But yeah, that's a danger that I want to watch out for as well, is saying that, there's an easy way, there's an easy answer. I'm human. And so, if you're not like me, you must be not human.
Yeah. And the other way around, I don't have a live example now, but I know there are fossils of different kinds of animals that when you look at the fossils itself, you would say these are the same species. But then it turns out considering other stuff, they're totally different species, not in any way related.
That happens a lot in the hominin, in paleoanthropology, the study of these hominin fossils, because oftentimes you find just scrap, right? And so you're looking at really partial remains of these things. And so sometimes one scientist will see one species and another scientist will see two species. And so there goes the debate. And I think creationists try to capitalize on this and say that, scientists don't really know what they're talking about. To me, it just tells me scientists are trying to make the best story they can with with basically junk.
Yeah,
The fossils we have are so broken, and some of the most interesting fossils are some of the most broken. So who
and of
knows?
course, everyone wants to have the find of the year
Of
and
course, yes.
make it
I would
this
love to have
or
that.
her, and so for example, about Sadiba, I read once that there are reasons to think. I don't know if they're good reasons or bad reasons, but there are some reasons to assume that perhaps it's also scrambled together from some pieces of Australopiths and some other pieces of
Yeah.
Homo, and then
Yeah.
found somewhat in near each other, and well, it should have come from the same individual, and we call it whatever we call it, but
Yeah, Sadiba. Yeah, I think the more interesting question there, the one that I've seen in the literature has been discussion of the mandibles of the two skeletons. So there are people who believe that the two skeletons found there at that site represent two different species because the mandibles are quite different. There are other people who say, nah, mandible shape can be very variable, and so it's possible that these two things are the same species. There's a current debate going on right now. You might have heard of the Littlefoot skeleton coming out of South Africa. It's the most complete Australopithecus skeleton ever discovered. And the main scientist involved in that work, Ron Clark, wants to revive a name called Australopithecus prometheus to describe this skeleton. And there are other scientists who say, nah, it's just Australopithecus africanus. There's another site in the Republic of Georgia called Dmanisi. There, the researchers involved in that, I've seen them use multiple names on different occasions. There's an ongoing discussion now about whether the skulls they found there are the same species or too diverse and represent multiple species.
yeah, didn't they find about 5 skulls together
They did, yes,
quite
5
differently?
different skulls, and it's
Yeah.
a very small. It's an extremely small area that it's been excavated, so you would sort of expect it to be basically all the same thing. But the skulls are so very different that people are thinking this can't possibly be the same species, right?
You'd almost think some very early colleague of yours was already doing the same thing back then.
Oh, probably,
They
yeah.
found it yeah, but that's also a criticism. I think you also heard from mostly the critics about the anti-creation critics. You guys, you can't even figure out whether it's human or it's ape. So this makes our case, right? There's blending from one to another.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah. So the criticism there would be that, creationists, you look at different creationists and different assessments of these fossils, and you're going to come up with different diagnoses. Exactly. That some creationists say this is human, other creationists say it's not human. So I say Homo naledi is human, and there are other creationists who are just as sure that I'm totally wrong, that it is definitely not human. Is that evidence that evolution is true and that there's these intermediates that just sort of blur the line between human and non-human? I think that is sort of cherry picking, honestly, because when you look at actual creationist opinion on the full range of hominin fossils, mostly what you find is agreement. I don't know a single creationist. I suppose there are some out there, but I don't know any young age creationists who don't think that Neanderthals are human. Now, I say that, and somebody's going to say, well, there's this guy. Okay, fine. But for the most part, most of the informed individuals that I know of in the creation movement, and I keep tabs on this pretty well, they're all going to say that that Neanderthals are human. They're going to say Homo erectus is probably human. They're going to say Homo floresiensis is human. They're going to say that Australopithecus afarensis, the Lucy skeleton, that's not human. They're going to say that Australopithecus africanus, which is the South African form, that's not human. They're going to say Paranthropus is not human. They're going to say Ardipithecus is not human. We agree on almost everything. Where we don't agree, are the things that are new, okay, the recent discoveries. Yep, Naledi and Sadiba. And they tend to be where we're still sort of going over the data, right? And so it doesn't surprise me in some cases that is a source of disagreement. Other cases, something like Homo habilis, for example, or Homo rudolfensis, we just have extremely fragmentary material, right? And it's quite possible to find evolutionary scientists who also disagree on exactly what those fossils are and how we should name them and how we should classify them. So it doesn't surprise me that some creationists think one thing and other creationists think another thing.
No.
I don't think that's necessarily something where you should say, oh my goodness, there you go. Those dumb creationists don't know what they're talking about. They've proved evolution for us. I think what we're showing you is, new things tend to spark disagreement, big shot, and things where there's not a lot of evidence tend to spark some disagreement as well.
Yeah, and of course, the secular researchers not coming to agreement might have to do with this blending in as well. It might have to do with problems deciding what it is because of the material itself.
Yeah. So I don't look at disagreements over Australopithecus Prometheus or Homo habilis among the evolutionists as being evidence that evolution is not true, that creation is the real thing. I just think that things are different, and it's hard to tell some things, and so yeah.
We have another one coming in from Ruper de Poop again. Was Adam more similar to a chimp than modern humans are?
I don't know. I don't know that because I don't know, for example, what group the chimpanzees come from and what their ancestral form would mostly be like. Chimpanzees and gorillas both are notorious for having an extremely poor fossil record. That might come as a surprise to some of you folks because you're constantly hearing about ape fossils in the fossil record. But the reality is, I think with chimpanzee, there's a couple of teeth finally that have been discovered that have been said to be chimpanzee. And I think there's at least one fossil that's said to be more similar to a gorilla than to anything else. But generally speaking, there is not much of a fossil record for these things. So I've been, I just completed another study that hopefully will be in the International Conference on Creationism, where I looked at trying to delineate what sorts of groups there are among the apes. So doing the same sort of thing I did with humans all these years, trying it out on apes and trying to figure out what groups there are there. And it's a mess. There's a lot of evolutionary disagreement about how to put apes in categories. And that seems to be intrinsic to the sorts of characteristics that they have. So I'm thinking either we have a poor sampling of created kinds of apes, so it's hard to tell where the lines should be drawn, or we have just really fragmentary evidence again for a lot of these things. So it's really hard to, figure out how to interpret them. But it was not easy to decide, is this part of the chimpanzee created kind or not? So for me, the jury is still out on that question. And so to be able to answer the question, was Adam more similar to chimpanzees than we are? Maybe not. I don't know. Yeah. It's hard to say.
Well, what you say about the sparsity of ape fossils. I mean, imagine you want to try to get fossilized yourself.
Right, yeah.
How hard would it be, right?
Exactly.
So I think 95% of the fossils is marine, and then you have some 5% others, and then, well, what will get fossilized? probably those who can't get away from some kind of flooding or earth movement or something fast. Otherwise, maybe more or less intelligent beings would flee the surface before they get buried, right? So yeah, I think it makes sense. You don't have a lot of human and ape fossils in that way.
Yeah.
We have more from Ruben de Pup. Let's see. I start with the first of the three. We have some follow-ups. If two species start out 95% similar and then start evolving independent from each other, then after a while you'd expect the difference to be greater, because some traits started out the same. So if divergence is to be expected, then in the past they must have been more similar. So if God created two similar species, say humans and chimps, then it's not surprising to find that they were more similar in the past than today, because they diverge over time. Yeah, maybe that's more of an announcement than a question, perhaps.
More of a
Maybe,
comment than a question, yeah. And
yeah,
that's only true if you discount convergence, right? If you only have divergence in your model, it's possible that that's true. But if you have convergence possible in your model, because all changes don't have to be random, we don't have to be Darwinians, right? Because we're creationists, so it's possible there could be program changes, which would then suggest that it's possible to have real convergence, where two branches of a created kind become more similar over time. So I don't know that I want to rule out that possibility right off the top of my head. I think it sort of makes sense, but maybe not. Maybe the world is weirder than we think.
Who knows? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, of course, he meant what you think of that, but I think you just
There you go. I don't know.
You replied with that. Well, I think we have a lot of ground covered now, so it's nearing 9:30, so at least here. So we wrap it up if it's okay with you.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Wood, I'd like to thank you very much for your interesting presentation. I'm really happy you found the possibility to do so. I wish you all the best with your work, with
Thank you.
Also, of course, and well, God bless. If you don't mind, I switch to Dutch now for some some announcements for our Dutch public.
Sounds good.
Bedankt voor het kijken allemaal. En in het bijzonder natuurlijk degene die vragen hebben ingestuurd. Dat maakt het ook een heel interessant laatste deel, denk ik. We willen natuurlijk... Deze livestream van Logos is op YouTube. Er is ook natuurlijk de website www.logos.nl, waar natuurlijk ook heel veel artikelen te vinden zijn. En ook links naar eerdere uitzendingen. Mocht u interesse hebben gekregen over wat hier besproken is. Er is heel wat te vinden als u even de zoekmachine gebruikt op bijvoorbeeld fossielen, mensen, apen en dat soort termen. Dan is er heel wat materiaal dat misschien nog iets toe kan voegen aan wat er hier besproken is. Dat is natuurlijk een heleboel informatie. Normaal gesproken zou er aan het einde van een uitzending als dit een collectezak rond kunnen gaan, waar wij live met elkaar in dezelfde ruimte. Dat is natuurlijk via het internet wat lastiger. Logos Instituut is geen winstgevende organisatie, maar heeft natuurlijk wel middelen nodig om dit soort dingen te kunnen doen. En daarom is het wel altijd fijn als er iets kan worden bijgedragen. Dus mocht u daarvoor wat voelen, er komt op het scherm een QR-afbeelding en daarmee kunt u eventueel een gift geven. Het is ook handig, wat ik in het begin ook al zei vanavond, als u zich bijvoorbeeld op het kanaal van Logos op YouTube abonneert, zodat elke keer als er weer een livestream aan de orde is, dat u daarvan op de hoogte bent. Bijvoorbeeld, komende februari, 8 februari, hebben we Dr. Matthew McLean bereid gevonden om te spreken over de relatie tussen vogels en dinosaurussen. En hoe moeten we reageren op mensen die zeggen, nou ja, vogels zijn gewoon eigenlijk nog dinosaurussen, zijn geëvolueerd uit de dinosaurussen. Hij heeft op dit gebied veel ervaring en we zien er ook erg naar uit. En 11 maart hopen we een debat kunnen laten zien tussen een atheïst en een christen over het onderwerp macro-evolutie. Er is ook wat beperkte ruimte voor publiek, maar daar volgt nog meer informatie over. Dus hou Logos in de gaten. U kunt zich ook aanmelden voor de nieuwsbrief en dan worden ook dit soort dingen wordt er ook in vermeld. Nou, dat zijn van mijn kant de mededelingen. Nogmaals hartelijk dank voor uw aanwezigheid en graag tot een volgende keer.